So as I said, today we are focusing on achieving transformational change through dialogue, and change has to be one of those most used, perhaps even overused words of our modern times. And so we will look into that a little bit more, but also particularly looking to focus on this resource and this practice of being in dialogue and what that has to do with transformation. So that's where we'll be focusing today. And we've got around about just under the hour now to do that. So my name's Lorraine Flower, and I'm part of Azure, which is a conscious leadership and organizational development consultancy. We use the phrase conscious leadership because on several levels of that word conscious, we're hoping through the work that we do, both with clients and in the wider space where we offer this type of resource, to raise awareness and have people think differently about the role of leadership and the role of organizations. We also take that to another level, which is trying to bring in something that is more connected with a higher purpose. We particularly favor the phrase greater good, recognizing that if we can commit ourselves individually, personally, as leaders and as collectives through organizations, through businesses, to something that is defined as greater good, more than us, bigger than us, then we start to have a chance of changing the world, which is where real change is really needed. So we invite you to enjoy this session and to, as I say, participate in the way that feels most comfortable for you. I wanted to start with this word transformation, because again, a word that gets used, but what do we really mean by it? And what's the difference between change and transformation? Well, transformation is, in our minds, something that goes beyond change in many respects. Yes, it is about change, but it's actually going deeper, because it's typically tends to be quite radical, not necessarily just in the shock value sense of radical, but radical in the sense that it is actually changing a state of being. It is going beyond form, transform. And so often in our organizational worlds, we're very focused on structures and processes, organization charts, tasks, things that we can touch and see that feel very tangible. We talk about culture, we talk about mindsets, but actually in terms of that, getting into that radical shift in this area, we struggle quite often. We struggle with how to do that and what that looks like, and how to sustain that without it being an act of being done to. So when we're thinking about transformation in this space of change and why that might be needed, we also have to think about mindsets and behaviors and relationships, but also things like potential, possibilities. How do we think in wholes, as in allness, rather than in parts, which is often where we end up when we're in the more sort of change space, the more incremental change space. What we also know about change in the way we have been doing it over recent decades, certainly the last 10, 15 years, is that in many ways what we set out to achieve through a change management approach often doesn't stick. It often doesn't last for any sustained period of time. Sure, we do get some impacts from it, but actually in terms of our overall goals, often we find that we've not been able to bring that to fruition as fully as we would like. And this is some research from McKinsey, but again, it's something that is backed up in so many other research that is done into change management and how that actually lasts in an organization, how it really lands. And typically what we find with change management is that the change fatigue sets in, and people or the process or the collective runs out of energy. The number of things that we've been involved in where there's a really good push at the beginning, and then somehow it just kind of loses that focus. And quite often that can be through lack of sponsorship at the right levels. It can be through lack of sustained sponsorship over time, and also overly focusing on just one area, one person for that sponsorship. It's often also failing because we lack the capabilities for true transformational change. We're focused on things in a much more structural sense, planned and programmatic sense, and a lot less in the transformation space. And we'll come on to a bit more of that. And often these change programs are too top down, and often are failing to truly engage frontline workforce, the people who are really the substance of any change that is needed. And so if we fail on that front, we can't really expect change to stick over time. Now, having said that, obviously we do tend to rely on top down, it is important to get that senior level involvement, engagement, sponsorship. Of course, it's not about ignoring that, but it is about recognizing that that's not enough. It's no longer enough. If it was ever enough, it's certainly not enough in these days and in these times. Just again, to remind people, please do pop your thoughts and comments in the chat as we go along, and or raise your hand if you want to contribute, just as new people are joining us now. So when we're thinking about new ways of approaching the world, often the things that might appear on the edges of our world, on the edges of our knowing, can feel quite heretical. They can feel quite challenging. They can feel almost impossible at times, and that can also mean that they don't stick. You know, that they become very fragile. And so we need to build adoption. We need to build some level of commitment into new ways of creating the sort of organizations that we believe we're capable of creating and that we believe are needed in this world of ours. Now, there's lots of tools and philosophies and academic frames that have been put around a new form of leadership, a new way of actually building our organizations. And we'll all have heard of things like servant leadership models, systems leadership, holacracy, sociocracy. We've dealt with some of these in these previous webinars. And they all speak to aspects of what is needed in the transformational change space. But fundamentally, we have to be willing to open ourselves to new ways of working. And these can feel countercultural to us. They can feel almost impossible at times to really contemplate. We have to do things like challenge the role of top leaders, for example, and start to think about how we move away from those traditional pyramid mindsets, traditional hierarchy mindsets. We need to think about a more distributed power base, more skin in the game, in a more diverse and broad-based aspect of the organization. And we need to extend more trust to the front line, and that's a whole other webinar, which at some time maybe we'll do, is around our relationships with trust in organizations and how those are quite insidiously undermined through policies, through rules, through the way in which we treat people, through a parent-child model, which again, we've touched on previously. So some of those things that have actually stood organizations in really good stead in the industrial age, and as we've moved more into that sort of production and operational model, are not going to be right for us going forward, because the world around us is changing. Come on to just reminding us a bit more about that in a second. So I'm going to work on the assumption that somewhere deep inside us, we know that a different approach is needed, that we do feel, we have a sense as leaders, as perhaps OD practitioners, we have a sense that something new is needed. I'm going to, through this, just draw on a couple of parts of work that's been done by Helen Bevan and Steve Farmer in within the NHS, because this is an area where new approaches are certainly being explored and experimented with, and they've done a white paper which I would certainly commend to you if you're thinking about operating in this space of transformational change, because they've drawn on a lot of different models, but also have tested and validated that through a number of different case studies as well, all of it which are in the health space but still have some relevance. And where they are coming out is, and they've related this to healthcare, but where they're coming out is recognizing that really, if we want to move into the next stage of organizational life with some grace and some ease, we do have to look to new skills that are in the innovative thinking and creativity space. Again, words that we're starting to hear more frequently in organizations, and yet we don't really know how to unleash that or how to harness that. We're still thinking about it in a relatively systematic, structured way, rather than in a more networked and potential and possibility-based way, which is what's needed if we're to move into a new stage. So new skill sets, that doesn't necessarily mean we then have to rush out and hire lots of people, but it does mean we need to shift the way we look at the capability and the capacities we have in the organization. So we've got to get beyond a sort of micro change approach where we are satisfied with small wins and start to think about something that is really connected to a higher vision, something that is a more stretching sense of where we want to get to, and then tap into our appetite for it and hopefully find the appetite that'll take us forward. Now, today we're not going to talk about a lot of the traditional change models. These are some, there are many others. You'll have no doubt come across a lot of these, if not all of them. And they all have a part to play. They're all bringing aspects of the change journey into our awareness, into our practice. And so they have a validity, and nothing I'm saying today is about saying all of this is rubbish, we just need to start again. It's not that, and I'll come on and develop that a bit further, but it is about recognizing the limitations of the thinking that has gone into some of these models so far, and that we are starting increasingly to learn more about how we can take some courage in the way we engage with people in the organization when we're thinking about change and transformation. And we have to also remember that actually organizational development as a discipline is still relatively young in the overall history of organizations, at least as a conscious science. So this isn't about beating ourselves up. This is about testing and opening up our appetite for perhaps doing things differently. I mentioned the shift in mindset that is needed, and again, this is drawn from Helen Bevan and Steve Farmer's paper, the quote. For me, what stands out in it is this need to step into bringing in additional voices and also really respecting the diversity in our organizations. Now, we all know that diversity is very, very much on the agenda at the moment. So not to say it hasn't been in the past, but every which way you look, people are either recruiting diversity and inclusion directors or revisiting their programs in this area. So the great news is that from a consciousness point of view, and indeed, slowly, but hopefully surely from a practice and behavioral and values point of view, we're starting to explore this whole area of diversity. But it has a key place in change too. It has a place in philosophically, mindset-wise, but also in practice, helping us to think about what we tap into and how we tap into the richness that exists within our organization, beyond the kind of job description boxes, beyond the organization structure, beyond the functions and roles, but actually looking to people and looking to possibility. And that brings us into a whole different interaction and a whole different relationship with those in our organization. So it's certainly incumbent on us as people who are leaders in this space, all of us, to really challenge our own mindset and think about the degree to which we are willing to let go of our old paradigm thinking, or at least restructure it so that it opens space for some new paradigm thinking, some new ways of approaching change, which the dialogue aspect is a cornerstone, I believe, in how we might go forward. Let's just take a moment, though, to remind ourselves what we're working with in our world today, because whilst this can feel a little overwhelming, it's also actually a fairly fundamental enabler in this space of transformation. In our world today, and I'm not, teaching you anything you don't already know here or bringing anything on, but I bring it in just for context, is really one that is full of complexity. The challenges that we're facing, both within organizations and on a more societal and global level, are undoubtedly complex. We're facing a lot of uncertainty. We're facing incredible pace, intensity of what we're having to cope with, in terms of it within our physiological being, let alone actually then turning that into changed forms, as it were, transformed. Lots of new rules, lots of new ways of having to function, digital capabilities coming at us every which way. The virtual world, which is in a sense a subset of that, enabled by the digital, but brings with it its own possibilities and potential, as well as perhaps some challenges. A lot of new activism coming forward, new in its new incarnation, not that it hasn't been brought forward before, but things around justice, equality, fairness, being interpreted on many different levels. And in this world that we're facing, we can get exhausted, as I'm sure many of us are. We can feel like we're a little perhaps overpowered by some of it. And that may cause us to perhaps put our heads in the sands a little bit at times. And that's okay for 5 minutes. That's okay even for a day off. But it's not okay on an ongoing basis from a leadership perspective. And therefore, really what we're being called to do in this time is jump into the sea, jump into this world that we're in. We are part of it. We've chosen leadership, therefore we have a responsibility in that space. And somehow we then have to ride the wave, not just in a being, thrown around by it, but in a way where we learn to surf it and we learn to actually cooperate with it and collaborate with it. So as we think about that shift in our thinking and mindset, and we think about the old paradigm, the new paradigm, in using the word old, of course, it becomes pejorative, and perhaps a better way of thinking about it is how we bring the two paradigms, our more well-known paradigm with the perhaps emerging paradigm, how do we bring them together to a new point of synthesis? How do we bring those together in a way that isn't about discounting all that we know and have learnt from the existing paradigm, but that we actually start to bring something new into that is sufficiently fundamental that it can step into this transformative space. And this schematic in some ways brings those two polarities, if we want to call them that, those two paradigms, brings that forward, I think, in a very succinct way. On the left-hand side, the so-called dominant approach is really back into that space of the structure, the processes, control, transactions, rationality, all of that space where we use experience as our guide, and we kind of take our steps forward based on the past. Whereas in the emerging paradigm, we're centering ourselves in what is the present, what is right now, and we're using the power of connection. We're using the power of openness, of dialogue, of relationship, of connection through a shared purpose. So at a much deeper level than mission and vision. Not that those aren't powerful, but the purpose takes us into a different relationship that actually allows us then to open into that trust that I was talking about earlier. Because through shared purpose, if we're confident that we've got everybody, we're all in that same space, then that's what's going to guide our actions. That's how we can start to trust people and their actions much more fully. And this is a much more viral space in this emerging space, much more viral. And therefore dialogue, conversation, interaction, that type of transaction is much more revealing and much more powerful in terms of the change process itself. So dialogue is something that could be a gateway into this new point of synthesis, where we bring the best of what we know into what we are starting to explore and understand, what we don't yet fully comprehend, what is not yet proven through legions of case studies, but where we have to be perhaps more of the pioneers in that space. And dialogic OD, which is, again, if we're looking at the old paradigm, new paradigm, is very much in that new paradigm space, is a possible gateway into that. It picks up on a lot of those emergent themes that I shared in the previous slide. And yes, it's jargon, it's HR jargon, it's academic jargon, if you will. But what it offers us, the kind of immediate value of it, is getting us into this space of dialogue, of really trying to understand what we mean by dialogue and how that might have a place in our transformational work and in our change program work. Again, if we just look at that in the context of two paradigms, and there's a lot of information on here, it reflects in many ways the previous schematic. But what we see when we look at our traditional ways of helping organizations to work, we're typically doing that through the more diagnostic lens. So we want to think about the system as it currently is. We want to plan change. We often will do it in a more episodic way. We will tend to do it through more transactional type interventions. We don't tend to kind of work in a more networked way. We want to stay in the space of reality, as it were, and we become very results focused in it. People rightly want to see the impacts of that. Again, not decrying that. That's not about that it's negative, but it's not enough, really, is the issue. It's not enough. And what we're really needing to do is move into and embrace what is now being described as more dialogic OD. Not going into the full details of all of that, but as you'll see through the language there, it really picks up on this emergent, continuous, transformational, being immersed in. And so instead of it solely relying on the starting at the top, working down, it's getting into the organization and allowing that to spread out. And this is the work of Bush and Marshak, amongst others, for those who are interested in exploring a little further in that space. So let's get into then this idea of practice of dialogue. And of course, we all think we're doing that every day. Of course we do. We are in conversation. But we also know that's not really true dialogue, not in the sense of the generative dialogue that is needed in the transformational space. And so what we need to do is think about how we start to practice true dialogue in our organizations and take ourselves away from the transactional task space into a space of understanding. How do we generate more understanding within our organizations? Well, dialogue can be described in these four ways. This is the work of William Isaacs, who's a dialogue expert. And he offers us four ways of thinking about dialogue. Firstly, and we talk about listening all the time, don't we, in terms of relationships and effective, the effective relationship building. What's fundamental in listening, though, within the dialogue space is that we both listen to ourselves and to others. So it has a self-awareness element to it. And that in that listening to self and others, what we do is drop our assumptions. We really come to the place where we are prepared to park our assumptions. But to do that, of course, we have to know what those are. So that's where some of the self-awareness comes in. And we also have to be aware of our resistance in the listening space and really start to open ourselves up more to empty, in a sense, to come into a more empty space. We also have to respect where the other is at, but also where we're at in our conversation. And so allow things to be as they are, rather than see dialogue as a means of changing the other. So be present with what is, rather than trying to move it to what you believe it should be. And we also, therefore, having identified our assumptions and our any resistance that we may have or any agenda that we may be holding, we have to suspend all of that. We have to be prepared to see with new eyes, and to bring ourselves into dialogue in the real sense, which of course is going to take time. It demands a certain amount of time and presence from ourselves. And we also have to be willing to find our own voice and allow others to find theirs. So where each party in the dialogue is speaking with an authority that is their own voice, but which is not seeking to dominate another. It's not seeking to stop another from being heard in that process. Theory U is something that is very active. It's a very active model in this space. This is the work of Otto Scharmer, and it's a very powerful body of work, which is to some degree being used in companies, but is being very widely used in expanding social dialogue and helping people to come to new levels of understanding where there may have been quite a lot of division or difference previously. So as we continue to think about this art of dialogue, we could perhaps also think about some other models that might help us, and Boehm's model here is another way of just taking us into that understanding of what we really mean by being in dialogue with another. Quite often we spend our time in the superficial space of politeness, where we talk nice and we keep within the rules, the rules of polite society, if you will, or polite organizational life. And in many ways that lacks authenticity, because it's really just staying on the surface and keeps us in the kind of old thinking space, the old paradigm space. In order to progress, we've got to move around this four-box model in some ways and move into a space where we break down some of those superficial thoughts or ways of working and the rules ways of working, and get into the willingness to talk tough, to get into the conflict, to break down some of that inauthenticity and reveal what wants to be revealed. And then move into a space from the breakdown where we can then think anew, work anew, be curious, get into more reflective or inquiry-based talking, and explore those assumptions, our own and others, explore the mental models, see what people think. And if this sounds a bit academic, yes, I guess it can be, but actually we all know when we've been in a really, really good open dialogue with another or with many others, and we can recognize that we've gone beyond that protective way of communicating with each other into a very open and mature way of communicating with each other, and where eventually we come into this place of flow. And as you can see from this model, I'll say a little bit more about flow in a second. What we're contrasting here is the degree to which those conversations, that dialogue that we're having, is generating new thinking, and the degree to which it is either perpetuating or challenging old thinking, the degree to which we're thinking as individuals, and the degree to which we're working and dialoguing as a whole. And the space of flow in dialogue is generative. It's about generative talking. It's about creating new ways of thinking, being, talking, doing. And Roy, thank you for your contribution in the chat. When we're thinking about dialogue, let's move off persuasion. Searching for a deeper truth. I like that. And there's so much evidence of us getting into that sort of war mentality, the needing to win arguments rather than to be in a space of true dialogue. So absolutely, really go with that, and overcoming the hierarchical power structure, I think, is exactly what we're really talking about here. And if we go and just kind of develop that a little bit further, we then also can see that some of the principles of dialogue that emerge are, they're not rocket science, are they? They're things that we know, but which are quite hard to practice. And one of the reasons that I think they're quite hard to practice is because they take a bit of time. Like any new skill that we have to learn, there's the time to learn the skill, and there's a time to be in it and to practice it and to actually genuinely value what comes out of it. And that also means we have to take some of that short-term task mentality. We have to suspend that. We have to move that out to one side. And so if we can get into this space of dialogue, we do then start to create much more openness and much more flexibility. And over the longer term, we will start to see transformation happening. And it will be at a much more foundational level and a lot less superficial level, and therefore have the potential to sustain. When we think about that sort of generative space, that generative talking, we need, and that flow-based space, we can perhaps also think about some work that was done by Erhard in his book, The Heart of the Matter, where he offers us 3 kinds of talking as a way of thinking about this interaction that we're having. And so often we are caught up in this talking about space, and I'm conscious that's effectively what we're doing here today. I know we're not in dialogue in this space, so it's not, that's I'm not blind to that in that sense, and potentially this is not the right format for that. So we would clearly get into a very different format if we were going into more generative talking. But thinking about these different kinds of talking, most of us spend most of our time in the talking about space, where we're describing, reporting, explaining situations or events. And it doesn't change the thing we're talking about in itself. So when we're talking about something, we're really just in that descriptive mode. So, for example, talking about tennis in the clubhouse doesn't actually change the performance on the court, generally speaking. Somebody might pick up a tip that might, they might take away and do something with. But on the whole, just describing what's going on in itself doesn't change the event itself or the practice. If we get into this more evocative talking, it does at least start to bring us into relationship with something, because the evocative talking is something that connects us right here, right now, in the moment with what is going on. So it's got that emotional element to it, the feeling element to it. And we might liken that to poetry or powerful storytelling. And storytelling is a key tool, or should be, within organizational life, because that is where we start to get into that more evocative exchange. And it can in itself start to engage us on a much more physiological level, a much more whole level in that sense. But then there's the talking that alters. And this is where, when we get into that generative flow space, we have the potential to create new thoughts, new ideas, new ways of working that alters, that brings new possibility. And an interesting example in that arena is going back to the Declaration of Independence in the US in 1776. When the people who were bringing that forward spoke about all the different aspects of the truths that they were expressing in that, they really had no evidence of those things being true or becoming lived realities. And so, for example, one of those about the equality of men. But it was a truth that was brought forward through the way in which they allowed themselves into the possibility of the world they were creating or would be creating and are still seeking to create. And we can obviously have a whole other conversation about where the US is in that process, but nevertheless it went beyond being evocative and went into being a way of expressing, and that actually alters the conversation and the reality, and still does today, as we know. So different kinds of talking are also a key part of how we create dialogue. Also at the heart of dialogue is how we expand involvement and open up to different influence. As we know in our hierarchical structures, we get caught up in that sort of top-down power base. And not because people are bad people, but it's what we've been trained in over several centuries now, and which has been reinforced in that very production output focused model. But if we want to not only respond to but thrive in the world that is increasingly emerging and will be coming, and I firmly believe is here to stay, this more emergent, this more complex, this more open world that is starting to emerge, then we have to also get into a mindset where we're looking to increase influence and involvement from a much more diverse group of people, as I said earlier. And that as we do that, we can then surface and resolve all of those challenges that might be preventing change from being sustained, but also change our own minds about what the change is in some respects. So it's about that, not just holding on to a fixed idea. Sure, we need a clear vision of where we're trying to get to, but not holding on to things so tightly that we're not prepared to hear other voices. And as we know in change, that where we don't include people, they have a way of reminding us that they're really important. They have a way of becoming disruptors or blockers, or becoming a voice that is out of kilter with what we think we're trying to achieve. And that's because we've ignored that. We've ignored that element in our whole system. And it's a bit like ignoring, if you stub your toe and you ignore it and you think that's okay, I've just stubbed my toe, it's causing me a little bit of pain, I won't worry about it, and you carry on ignoring it and ignoring it. If you don't take care of it, eventually it can have a much more damaging impact on your overall physical health. And therefore, really being inclusive means that we have to bring him on board and be open to some of the voices that maybe are less palatable or less in keeping with the overall mindset that we're promoting. Some of the things that might be barriers to dialogue in organizational change, I'm sure you could add to this list. These are some that certainly we trip over and recognize in the organizational space. Time, well, the number of times you hear the word time mentioned, and I guess particularly in this very pacey world that we're in. Yes, time is a factor. To move into this more dialogue-based form of change does require a different attitude to time. It does, at one level, require more time, but again, if you were to add that up in a more sort of mathematical equation sense, it requires a different approach to time now that actually will release time in the future. And so it's about how we get ahead of the curve in that respect, and the willingness to break through our resistance to creating space and time for this type of way of being and changing. Scale can sometimes be something that will derail our thinking in this space, particularly if you're part of a huge global organization. The question is, where do we start? And this is when it's a massive tanker that you're working through and with, how do you suddenly get from A to B? Well, you don't suddenly get from A to B, of course. You start somewhere, and you start to do something on a local scale level as an experiment, an R&D, and then you start to work out how to expand that on. Control is a barrier, because whilst ever we're holding on to that need to keep our arms around everything, we're going to be threatened by anything that pops up that looks or feels different, and possibly not know how to deal with that. So we have to be able to suspend our need to control everything and identify in that blending of the kind of more transactional based change with the more emergent based change, working out what are appropriate touch points for what we might call control or monitoring, rather than, everything having to be controlled. We have to also think about our attitude to disruption, because there will be some. And typically we're averse to that. We've got, a risk management, a risk averse attitude quite often in organizations. And therefore, anything that feels disruptive feels like it's going to take us away from meeting the financial targets or the KPIs that we've set ourselves in an organization. And so that's where we have to challenge some of the current paradigm thinking, of course. Skills, well, we may lack the skills. And of course, that is something we can invest in and can choose to develop if we want to, if we see this as something that is useful. That can be a blend of internal and external support that actually achieves that. Mindset, of course, is also a potential barrier. We've touched on that a couple of times. Really being able to examine where our own attitude and appetite is at, and asking ourselves the question about the courage we have to shift that for ourselves, and then to challenge that mindset within an organization. And power is another one, and I just wanted to offer something a little bit more in this space of power. Again, we're talking about old and new paradigms here, or current and perhaps potential ways of doing things. Power, we know, is something that is both above the radar and below the radar in organizational life, and in the world for that matter, in life generally. And so part of this more dialogic approach, dialogue-based transformation, means that we do have to confront some of our attitudes around power and how that is distributed within the organization and within the infrastructure that underpins that. And of course, from that very sort of top-down mindset, we will see a lot more of the power being held by the few, being quite transactional, being quite closed, quite command-based, even though that might feel again like an old word as we move into it's more emotionally intelligent leadership. But actually it sits quite deep in our DNA, so we need to be aware of that and open ourselves into this space of more open relational power, where we are seeing that the many can have a voice and are relevant in our expression of power. So as we look to other considerations, things that we might need to have on our radar when we're thinking about perhaps moving into more transformational change with dialogue at its core, we still need to have a clarity of vision, and we need to step into that understanding of purpose that I mentioned earlier. It's important that we think territory, not map. One of the challenges of mapping our way, so that sort of linear mapping, is that we can sometimes get a little bit caught up on a plan and need to stick to that. Whereas if we can start to understand our landscape, understand the territory, then we can start to be much more resourceful about what's needed where and how we interact with that. We've got to perhaps think about how we bring in more of an experimental mindset, challenging ourselves into this risk aversion and into more of an R&D mode. So the word innovation comes up a lot, creativity comes up a lot in our organizations. But again, we've got to confront ourselves about what's our real appetite for throwing out some of the old rules, as it were, and moving into something that does feel more experimental. We've got to also really get to know some of the systems thinking work and think about how we might map our system, both the visible and the invisible parts of it, and where the bridges and the networks sit within that will facilitate some of this distribution of conversation, dialogue, new ways of talking, and new ways of bringing forward the agenda in a way that actually sustains the change. We've got to think about our own role as leaders and change agents in this process. There's a phrase that's used in the dialogic OD space, which is self as instrument. And if we can again get away from the jargon of that, we all hopefully recognize that as we interact with the situation, however we show up, whoever we are, whatever attitudes and mindsets we bring, we're having an impact on that situation. It's a sort of quantum physics reality, really, that as we engage with something, so we are impacting it, we're affecting it. And so having really deep understanding and awareness of ourselves as agents of change is really important in this space. We have to find new ways of monitoring and evaluating our progress so that it's not so caught up in that sort of fixed transactional space. We need to find ways of touch points, of new qualitative expressions of our progress and our success. We also, as someone who's very supportive of planful approaches and absolutely sees the value of them, we also have to kind of take on that mindset that says, well, let's start somewhere. Let's find a place. It might be a department, it might be a whole function, it might be a project, it might be a group that somehow shines out to us as somewhere to start and to experiment and to kind of learn our craft a little bit in this space. And we also have to think disruption. We have to think that that's okay. It is okay for things to not flow in a smooth, linear way, but to open ourselves up to something that is more random in many ways, but in its randomness also brings us a new pattern and a new way of looking at our whole entity. We do have some help around at the moment. There's much more than this, but these are some of the kind of more immediate things. The digital world actually helps us because it allows that networking to move across physical boundaries. We'd all argue, having spent a year online trying to do our work, that this kind of online environment is not perfect. It's not the panacea, but it brings many advantages that cannot always be addressed in the physical space. And that, not least of those, is that we can start to connect people in dialogue in a way that maybe weren't able to be connected previously. Sure, we have to learn some new skills about how to feel safe and open to doing that in the online environment, and increasingly that experiment is underway. But it does provide us perhaps an opportunity, and that kind of really goes to that virtual space as well. So as we recognize and increasingly start to harvest some of the benefits of this virtual space that we've been in the last year, we can then apply those into this space of connection and a different way of talking. The EDI agenda, I think, also is something that helps us as we explore equality, diversity, inclusion within our organizations. What if we were to really stretch that dialogue, that conversation, that definition of equality, diversity, and inclusion into a space where it includes how we converse with each other, how we have meaningful conversations, how we create the space and the time for that. The continued uncertainty that will be around in our world is going to demand that we find new ways of transforming our organizations. So that uncertainty that is about that pace of change, all of those things that we know to be part of our world today, are also enablers as much as they are perhaps challenges to us. And we need to look out for the pioneers, which certainly in not just the UK, but globally, sits certainly in the health sector, the NHS in the UK. Education's also starting to look a little bit into this space as well. Of course, the academic world is doing some work in that space, but there are also individual change agents. We know of several OD experts who are in company doing some of this work, experimenting in this space, and of course practitioners like us who are trying to raise the lid on some of the new ways that this world can start to become a reality. What are some of the next steps that you might want to think about? Well, how might you start to induce new ways of thinking through more transformational conversations? How could you bring different voices into the change process? How can you release that possibility and potential that exists within your organization? Where's your edge of the ball of string, as it were, that you're prepared to start unraveling in order to put your foot into this particular body of water? And how might you combine the strengths of you know, what we might call old paradigm and new paradigm, or diagnostic processes and dialogic processes? So it's not about throwing out what we've come to know and trust in many ways, but it's about how we use those in a different way within a different context and with a different goal in mind in terms of dialogue. So these are some things perhaps to be thinking about as we come out of this particular session. Gary Hamel, you know, a well-known leadership and organizational academic guru, offers us this quote. This is from the Helen Bevan paper. We know that we have to change. We have to be able to keep up with the pace of change, and that the perhaps old ways of doing that in themselves are not going to serve us particularly well. And so thinking about our appetite really comes into that space of, can we see what's happening, accept what's happening, and then start to search for new ways of building our transformation agenda and start to move some new tools into our space. So thank you so much for listening and for being part of the webinar today. We're very happy that you've joined us. We will make the recording available to you in case there's anything that it triggers for you that you maybe want to go back and reflect on. And if there are any final comments anybody would like to either say or put into the chat, please feel free to do so before we close up. Thanks, everyone.